They keep saying the window is closing, but people who understand how capital really moves know the window doesn't close because of time, it closes because of access. Retail traders watch prices, institutions watch plumbing, custody, regulation, collateral frameworks, and capital efficiency. And in the last few months, something structural has been forming beneath the surface of global finance. Not hype, not speculation, not promotional narratives, but actual infrastructure. While retail was waiting for the next chart pattern, a new financial standard was being constructed in silence. Markets still label this industry crypto, but the people who actually move trillions quietly rebranded it as settlement infrastructure. In January 2026, Ripple secured its electronic money institution license, a regulatory passport that doesn't unlock a market, but an entire continent. Instead of fighting 27 countries one at a time, Ripple bypassed the regulatory friction layer in a single stroke. With more than 75 approvals globally, Ripple no longer sits outside the system asking to participate. The system is now integrating it. Once you cross that regulatory moat, you're no longer a startup, you become infrastructure, and infrastructure rarely stays cheap once it works. But licenses are just paperwork. The real shift is in the collateral and settlement plumbing. On January 15th, RLUSD entered institutional trading rails as collateral. In retail, stablecoins are digital cash. In institutional settings, stablecoins are capital efficiency. Collateral dictates liquidity velocity, leverage, margin obligations, FX hedging, and synthetic exposure. Once something becomes collateral, it stops being optional, not because people like it, but because math demands it. Institutions don't care about ideology, they care about basis points and execution. If a new rail improves efficiency 1%, the old rail dies. This is where XRP is still being mispriced. Retail treats it as a speculative token. Institutions treat it as a settlement rail. Store of value assets get hoarded, bridge assets get used. Bitcoin is digital gold. XRP is transactional infrastructure. Different mandates, different adoption curves, different valuation frameworks. Retail asks if it will go up, institutions ask if it settles, and if custody, compliance, and collateralization are clean. This is why Bitcoin ETFs now move over $5 billion a day. Awareness, custody, compliance, liquidity. XRP is following the same sequence, but with a different endpoint. Bitcoin is an asset you buy. XRP is an asset you integrate. The biggest blind spot is the liquidity gap. Bitcoin ETFs clear billions daily. XRP products still sit below 50 million. That isn't valuation, that's structural mismatch. Mismatches close violently when liquidity migrates from pre-funded banking rails to on-demand corridors. Legacy cross-border settlement relies on trapped liquidity, nostro and vostro accounts, multi-day FX windows, high friction, high opacity, high cost. Ripple's model replaces trapped liquidity with real-time settlement. Banks don't care about innovation, they care about cost basis. If something is cheaper, faster, and compliant, adoption becomes inevitable. And inevitability in finance doesn't scream, it accumulates. Regulatory arbitrage is another invisible component. The US fought clarity while Europe, Asia, and parts of the Middle East moved forward. Institutions didn't debate ideology, they followed the regulatory certainty. Capital always moves toward clarity. That's how custody cycles form. Bitcoin didn't explode because of hype, it exploded after custody became compliant. Once custody matured, ETFs were inevitable, and once ETFs existed, capital became systemic. The same pattern is unfolding. Ripple didn't chase hype, Ripple chased compliance, and compliance is the real moat. This is where CBDCs enter the picture. Governments are building sovereign settlement units, but none of them want to solve cross-border interoperability. CBDCs are domestic, SWIFT is slow, FX markets are fragmented. You need a neutral bridge asset that doesn't represent a single sovereign. The legacy system tried to solve this with messaging layers. Ripple is solving it with actual settlement. SWIFT sends messages, Ripple moves value. That difference sounds trivial to retail, but it isn't trivial to FX desks, central banks, or global liquidity providers. FX daily turnover exceeds $7 trillion. Cross-border payment volumes exceed 150 trillion annually. When you plug a bridge asset into that flow, the demand isn't speculative, it's mechanical. Another misunderstood component is custody fragmentation. Retail thinks about wallets, institutions think about custodians, segregated accounts, collateral multipliers, and regulatory audits. Once institutional custody for XRP matures to the same level Bitcoin now enjoys, ETFs, index funds, sovereign wealth funds, and pension mandates follow. Institutions don't rush, institutions position. They accumulate infrastructure before the retail crowd identifies it. Then comes collateral migration. Collateral assets don't sit on exchanges, they sit in segregated custodial environments, meaning exchange float collapses. When float collapses, supply shocks don't look like rallies, they look like illiquidity. Market makers widen spreads, slippage increases, and price moves discontinuously. Retail thinks markets move smoothly because they've only seen speculative cycles. Institutional cycles are discontinuous because they're engineered by custody, collateral, and liquidity constraints. RLUSD introduces a structural advantage because it allows separation between value storage and settlement velocity. XRP bridges, RLUSD stabilizes, and the two-asset model mimics existing FX and clearinghouse mechanics. This is how real financial infrastructure works. Banks don't want volatility in settlement units, they want volatility in traded assets. Stable settlement plus volatile bridge is the optimal design. Legacy systems still move cross-border value like freight on mules. Ripple laid fiber beneath the desert and is now installing the last segments of the pipeline. Another overlooked dimension is geopolitical neutrality. No country wants another country's currency as the global cross-border standard. XRP is neutral, and neutrality is a massive advantage when money becomes political. Dollar dominance isn't disappearing, but settlement fragmentation is accelerating. Europe does not want to settle everything in USD, China doesn't want net settlement clearing through New York, and emerging markets are tired of trapped liquidity and punitive FX rails. Neutral bridges win in multipolar systems. That's how commodities are priced, that's how indices are built, and that's how settlement rails evolve. Institutional adoption curves are predictable. First comes infrastructure, then compliance, then custody, then collateralization, then standardized products, then sovereign mandates. Ripple is already in the custody collateral phase. Standardized products are next, sovereign integration follows. This isn't speculation, it's just how financial plumbing evolves. The retail market keeps asking what the price target is, while institutional desks are asking what the discount window for adoption is. Retail still treats crypto as gambling chips. Institutions treat it as capital infrastructure. And this brings us to the final layer, supply. XRP supply and retail float is already declining, and institutional custody hasn't even fully arrived. When institutional custody arrives, retail gets structurally squeezed out. The window doesn't close because price becomes expensive, it closes because infrastructure becomes inaccessible. In 2017, markets were emotional. In 2026, markets are structural. This isn't about hype, it's about settlement rails, capital efficiency, custodial integration, regulatory clarity, collateral frameworks, CBDC interoperability, and sovereign neutrality. Most people wait for a headline, but infrastructure never moves on headlines, it moves on necessity. Institutions don't chase hype, they chase inevitability. And inevitability arrives quietly. One license, one integration, one collateral approval, one custody mandate, one sovereign endorsement, one ETF. And by the time retail asks when it happened, the infrastructure has already taken the market. The signal is here, the plumbing is installed, and capital is preparing to flow. The window isn't closing because price is high. It's closing because retail won't be able to buy infrastructure at retail prices. Stay sharp, follow the plumbing, ignore the noise, and understand the cycle, because the next phase is systemic. But the deeper layer most people overlook is incentive design. Institutions don't adopt new rails because they're innovative. They adopt because the old rails become inefficient relative to alternatives. Finance is a competition of efficiencies, not philosophies. Capital flows toward the superior mechanism until the inferior mechanism becomes obsolete. The legacy system never questioned Swift because there was no credible alternative. The moment credible alternatives appear, the economic basis for status quo dissolves. Technology doesn't replace old systems through argument, it replaces them through arithmetic. Once something becomes cheaper, faster, compliant, secure, and liquid, migration becomes mathematically inevitable. And liquidity follows efficiency the same way electricity follows the path of least resistance. This is where emerging markets become critical. Western investors think in terms of ETFs, but the real demand for settlement infrastructure comes from economies punished by FX spreads. multi-day remittance delays, capital controls, and chronic reliance on the dollar for net settlement. Emerging markets aren't fighting ideological wars between crypto and the fiat system. They are trying to escape financial friction. XRP sits at the intersection of that friction because bridge assets don't need loyalty, they need usage. When a Kenyan exporter settles with a Brazilian importer, they don't care about ideology. They care about time to settlement, slippage, cost, and FX transparency. Legacy rails force that trade through a maze of correspondent banks, liquidity buffers, and compliance checkpoints. New rails compress the entire path into seconds. Speed is not a luxury in finance, speed compounds. The longer capital sits idle, the less competitive the system becomes. The next stage is derivatives. Institutional markets don't scale until derivatives exist. Bitcoin didn't institutionalize through spot, it institutionalized through regulated futures, options, basis trades, and ETF incentivized hedging. Once derivatives appear, true adoption begins. Why? Because derivatives allow risk to be shaped, hedged, transferred, and priced. Spot markets determine direction, derivatives determine structure. XRP has not yet experienced a full institutional derivatives cycle. When it does, the liquidity profile becomes unrecognizable to retail because liquidity providers no longer care about narrative. They care about spread capture, basis arbitrage, and carry trades across FX corridors. At that point, price discovery shifts from speculation to necessity, and necessity cannot be charted on 1-minute candles. Another silent force is dollarization. Most people think dollarization is about currency adoption. The real power of dollarization is settlement dominance. The US dollar dominates because nothing competes with it in global settlement. But CBDCs challenge the assumption of dollar exclusive rails. However, CBDCs do not solve cross-border problems, they only digitize domestic settlement. Nations still need neutral bridges for multi-currency netting. This is why not a single CBDC project on Earth has solved cross-border interoperability without external bridges. Countries do not want to subordinate their CBDC to another country's currency. XRP is not a currency of a sovereign, and neutrality is a geopolitical advantage disguised as a technical specification. Neutral bridges reduce FX friction without creating new geopolitical dependencies. In a multipolar world, neutrality becomes valuable. And we are in a multipolar world, whether retail sees it or not. But the missing piece people fail to connect is that compliance is not a choke point, it's the distribution channel. When assets achieve regulatory clarity, they gain institutional distribution. Distribution beats speculation. Institutions cannot deploy capital into legal uncertainty. They don't ask for hype, they ask for custodians, audits, reporting, compliance, and liquidity. Bitcoin achieved that through ETFs and custody mandates. XRP is approaching the same threshold, but with a settlement thesis rather than a store of value thesis. And settlement assets are not valued by narrative, they are valued by flow. Flow determines demand because flow represents usage. Usage determines liquidity, and liquidity determines valuation. Retail investors learn to ask, what's the news? Institutional investors learn to ask, where is the flow? Because flow front runs price. And flow is currently migrating into compliant crypto rails through a regulatory backdoor that most retail never noticed. While the US argued over crypto risk, Europe built a compliant framework. While mainstream headlines argued over tokens, custodians quietly built infrastructure. While retail waited for bull markets, institutions built the plumbing required to move size. And once size moves, price is an afterthought. The last layer is brutal but simple. Retail doesn't get infrastructure pricing. Infrastructure doesn't wait for comfort or consensus. Infrastructure is adopted because the alternative stops working. The window doesn't close because price is expensive. It closes because access becomes professionalized. Retail gets invited early because institutions aren't ready. Once institutions are ready, retail is tolerated but not prioritized. The next phase of this space is not about narratives, charts, meme cycles, or speculative communities. It's about custody, compliance, collateral, settlement, derivatives, sovereign alignment, regulatory arbitrage, and liquidity migration. And liquidity migration is already happening quietly, one jurisdiction at a time, one approval at a time, one custodian at a time, one product at a time. Institutions don't look for the hype cycle, they look for inevitability. And inevitability arrives without fanfare. The window isn't closing because the price is too high. The window is closing because soon you won't be able to buy infrastructure at retail terms. Understand the plumbing and you understand the future. Ignore the noise and study the incentives. The signal is already here.